Welcome, men, to the Pursuit of Manliness podcast, where we are vigorously equipping men to pursue biblical manliness. My name is Jarrett Samuels. I'm the host of the podcast. Men, as always, I'd like to begin by thanking you for checking out today's show. Now, I want to encourage you to look at one specific link in the show notes, and that is thepursuitofmanliness.com/tribe. Currently, the registration for Tribe 13 is open. That session will run from December 1st till the end of May. You say, that seems like a long ways away. I know, but registration closes November 19th. Twice a year, we open up registration to this 6-month discipleship community. We have men from all across the U.S. We have men in Canada, the UK, Japan, Australia, Nigeria, and beyond, all over, coming together in this one community, moving the same direction to follow Jesus. Man, I would love for you to be a part of this, but before you think about it, I want to encourage you, visit that website. You're going to see, first of all, an image of a group of men in Tribe who did make their way to the men's retreat this fall. You're going to learn about frequently asked questions. Do I got to pay up front? What's all involved? What are challenge videos, Zoom calls? But keep on going. I want to encourage you, especially if you're married, get to the bottom. That's where you'll see some testimonies of some wives who will say, this is what's happened in our home since my husband's been a part of Tribe. To me, that's the greatest credibility to what we're trying to do here. When a man has a community like this, when he's willing to get in the Word, do the work, engage in this brotherhood, be sharpened by one another, and his wife and kids begin to take notice, there is no downside to that. I would love for you to be a part of that. Men, it's time for today's conversation.
Let's pray. God, I thank you for today. I thank you for the ability for us to connect. I thank you for the gift of technology that we are attempting to use for your glory. I pray for this conversation we're going to have. I thank you for Warner Wallace and his heart to write this incredibly thorough study and unpacking of Christianity and what it is and what that looks like. We say, God, everybody should have two things, a testimony and apologetic. And I thank you for this opportunity. I pray for those guys, a guy in his pickup truck somewhere, or maybe going down the road or working out or walking the dog, wherever he's at, who might hear this and it may just renew something in him, or maybe it stirs something that he considers the pursuit of Jesus and from a different perspective that he hasn't considered before. Or God, you just equip us better to live out the things that we say we believe. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, men, at this time, I want to introduce Mr. Warner Wallace. Brother, thank you for being on the show today.
Glad to be with you. It's my honor. So,
well, brother, you told me in the beginning to call you Jim, right? So I don't want to. Okay. Well, Jim, if you would you introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and then I would love to just chew on this book that you have written.
Well, I was a homicide detective for a number of years in Los Angeles County, and part of our duties when you're working homicides, actually, a lot of other agencies do it the same way. We would work collaterally. We would work unsolved cases. Unsolved homicides are called cold cases. There are no other kinds of cold cases. They're all murders because there's no statute of limitations on a murder. So I was working in a bunch of these. I became a Christian at 35. And that process for me, I was pretty skeptical. Didn't know any Christians, wasn't raised around Christians. I'm in Southern California. I mean, there's lots of folks here. I just didn't know them. Didn't have friends growing up who were Christ followers. Never got invited to church. But when I did go to church for the first time at 35, I was intrigued by something the pastor said. He said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And that started me wondering what was so smart about Jesus. So I bought a Bible and I started to look through it. And the Gospels were in some ways kind of surprising to me. I was aware of the contents loosely of what was probably going to be in there, just culturally. But the idea that this was an account that somebody wrote, expecting me to believe it actually happened in that way, that somebody had seen this, chronicled it in some way. I mean, those are the kinds of things I want to test. And there are processes in place for us to test those kinds of things from an investigative perspective. So I just took that approach. And I was already a senior investigator at my agency. And I was interested in forensic statement analysis. I was interested in reliability of witnesses. I'd been burned by that time a couple of times by witnesses on the stand, and when you took a case to trial, who had suddenly changed their story. And I thought, well, that was my fault. I should have done a better job of getting that guy out of our case early on, because clearly he's not a truth teller. So I learned some things, and I just took that process and I applied it to the Gospels, and that's really how I became a Christian. I just became convinced that the Gospels were recording something that actually happened the way it's described, and that something would be rather remarkable if, in fact, we can rely on the testimony of the resurrection. That would change the way I consider Jesus, not more than just a wise guy. He would be something completely categorically different if the resurrection really occurred. And that's what I needed to know. I needed to know if that was a reasonable inference from the evidence. And so that's really how I wrote the book. And I didn't write the book for many years later. I mean, I think it was probably 17 years later. I mean, I wasn't looking to write a book. I was working in cases in Los Angeles County, and I was busy. I was overwhelmed. I was swamped. But I had become, by that time, my kids were raised then. They were maybe in their elementary school years when I became a Christian. So by the time I was they were in high school, I was their youth pastor, and I was, volunteering in that capacity at our church and teaching this stuff to kids, to students, to high schoolers. And I met some people who you may know their names. Sean McDowell is an apologist. He's written a bunch of books. I've written one book with him now. And he had a high school class, and I was with his high school class, training that class to interact with atheists, when he said, you should write a book about this approach. And that's what got me writing the book. So here we are now, 10 years later. The book has really kind of taken off and got a life of its own. And I'm just grateful that anybody's interested in this approach, because I really got to tell you, I was kind of discouraged when I first became a Christian. I would ask other Christians like how they investigated Jesus, and I discovered that nobody had. So I felt like, really? I mean, so why are you a Christian then? Oh, I had an experience that demonstrated, I prayed for something. I was miraculously cured or healed or overcame a bad habit, and this is all good stuff. That's all really good stuff. But I've got a lot of people in my family. I've got mostly atheists it's kind of divided between atheists and Mormons. And my dad's second wife is a Mormon, and they've got great testimonies also. Doesn't make Mormonism true. And I don't know that anyone's testimony makes Christianity true. You have to test like you just said, you got to have a testimony and then a defense for why you think that really can be attributed to the Christian God. So you need both. You need both the testimony and the evidence, and so that's I was surprised that people didn't have that. They usually had the testimony part, but they didn't know why Christianity was true. And that's why I think when you level an objection about Christianity, especially to young people who are raised this way, they don't even know how to answer it. And they start to wonder if it could be true, given that the number of objections I could raise, even now, because I had those questions in my mind. I had those objections in my mind. I could do a pretty good job pretending to be an atheist, because I don't have to pretend very hard. I was one for 35 years. So I think we have to do a better job. And that's why I love that what you just said about having both the testimony and the apologetic.
Well, outside of you and Lee Strobel, I don't know too many people that really decided I'm diving into this Christian thing, because if the resurrection is true, then that changes everything for the history of the world. If Jesus died and he stayed dead, then we don't need to listen to anything he said, because he's just like you and me. Nothing. He just had a lot of great ideas, whatever. And they weren't even that great because he got killed, so it wasn't that great. But if he's alive, and that's what you dive into, then that changes everything. So what are some things maybe you came across in your pursuit of this to figure out if this is true or not?
Well, and you're right about Lee. Pardon me. He's become a good friend, and I didn't know. I think I got interested in this about 2 years before he wrote the Case for Faith, or Case for Christ. So I wasn't aware of his work, and I wasn't aware there was anybody else out there. And for me, I think I don't trust anybody. So even if I had like Lee, I'm like going, okay, I've got some questions about Jesus. Who can I ask? Who can I talk to? Well, I had questions about Jesus, and I didn't trust anyone to talk to, especially if the expert was going to be a Christian. Forget it. I was not interested. I needed to know, what is the data point that the expert is talking about? Like, what is it that they are, what is the evidence that they're going to talk about? I want to look at that myself, and then I'll make my own decision. That's just the arrogant, but that's also because, when you work in investigations and you work cold cases, I've been fooled by people who think they're, I mean, listen, I also see this all the time in criminal trials. I'll call an expert and he'll say one thing about the evidence, and they'll call a better paid expert who will say just the opposite. So experts are going to say what you pay them to say. So it's sad, but true. And so we have to kind of help jurors to realize you have enough common sense to be able to investigate this evidence for yourself. Let me just show you the case. Let me just show you the evidence, and you tell me what you think. By the way, those experts don't get a vote. Only you jurors get a vote. And I carefully made sure that there were no experts on that jury, because your common sense is good enough. So for me, that's what started me. I wasn't like Lee in the sense that I was trying to disprove my wife, because that's where Lee was. He was trying to disprove Leslie. That wasn't me. I just didn't think it was worth my time until I read the Gospels for the first time. And I realized, wow, this has a texture that I would expect if these are 4 accounts of the same event, because 4 accounts of the same event will never be the same. They'll never tell it precisely the same way. And there will be what appear to be contradictions that you can resolve, but at first they'll appear to be contradictions. And then your defense attorneys will make a big deal out of that when they go to trial. And when I first looked at those gospel accounts, I said, okay, this is worth me taking the extra step. Let's test these. And there's a process, and that's the process I describe in Cold Case Christianity.
So we're looking at a 10-year window from when you first wrote this to, the updated version. And I'll say this is an incredible book. This is an incredible resource that every believer probably should have on their shelf. And it's even got pictures. What's the downside of that? So, but I don't want to get into the pictures yet. What's changed in the 10 years as you update this, as you look at this from a decade perspective now, jumping 10 more years from when you first wrote it to, obviously you've grown in your faith and you've matured, but the world's changed some over that period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has. And well, there's a couple of things. I think that we are a much more visual world than we ever were before. And that's been going on for 10 years. And we've only become more and more visual. We have less and less patience. So we're not just visual. We're TikTok visual. It's got to be short. It's got to be persuasive. It's got to be rhetorically powerful quickly. And so I knew that I wanted to rewrite a lot of it, because I wanted to keep the depth of the information, because this is evergreen stuff. This stuff, we're investigating stuff from 2,000 years ago. Nothing new has happened. And now, there's a new development about Jesus. No, it's just the same old stuff. But there's a better way to investigate it, a better way to communicate it, especially if you're trying to reach folks that are in. Don't think for a second this isn't. I'm 62. But at 62, my attention span has been shortened just like everybody else. I've become more visual just like everybody else, because the media is doing this to us. The stuff that we're watching, the stuff that glowing rectangle in your hand has now changed the way we see the world. And I wanted the book to be as persuasive as it could be. And I learned a lot in the last 10 years about how to communicate this data to others, because now you get asked, okay, would you come talk about your book? Well, then you do it 1,000 times. And you realize, well, wow, there's a better way to say this. There's a better, more persuasive analogy. There's a better kind of structure of how you could make this case, same data, but a better structure for presentation purposes. Well, all of that is now in the book. There's not a single page I didn't update. And that's not a single chapter I didn't expand. And there's also new chapters in the book. And at the very end, there's a chapter with 12 segments on objections that are going to be offered, because we see a lot of objections in the last 10 years. I've reworked the entire archaeology section, because there are some things that change. It's not just that they change, that we're making, look, when you do cold cases, you make cumulative cases. This is death by 1,000 paper cuts. You have to build the case cumulatively in groups of evidence of certain types, all of which point to the same inference, to the same suspect. So I knew I wanted to rework some of these sections so they better would organize the material. But I knew also I don't want anyone to buy a book that if you've already got the first version of Cold Case. Well, I knew I'm targeting that audience, because I think we've changed the way we communicate. So I knew I had to present a lot more material, and there's a lot more material in this book, because this is, I think, what's required of an update. And I just wanted to make sure that this was a book that communicated that information well. And also, this is so much more visual. We had 90 illustrations and graphic elements in the first book. There are 390 in this book. So we're just trying to make this so it's a page turner in the sense that you can work your way through these illustrations and kind of get it. And that's why, I think also for young people, and this is true for all of us, if you had to write out a crime scene, all the data that's in the crime scene without seeing a picture of it and then try to memorize that page, it's so much harder to memorize than just a picture of the crime scene. Like there's people who see that for the first time. They've never seen a murder before, and they can recall great details because it's like ingrained in their mind. That's just the visual nature of what happens with images. So I know that if I could illustrate this in a way that you may not remember all the details, but you'll remember the image. It'll help you to recall it. Look, for number one, I want you to have confidence if you're a believer. But two, I want you to communicate this well to others. And you just need thumbnails, because most people, you don't need to have the depth that's required in a book. You just need to be able to kind of converse about the objection in a way that's rhetorically powerful and that is a thumbnail of the deeper material, because their objection is only a thumbnail. So I think in the end, that's what we try to do with this book.
One of the things that I believe about the resurrection that helps prove the resurrection was the historical account of the early followers of Jesus. And you have eyewitnesses, you have, guys writing these letters and putting actual names in there that you could go and say, hey, Marcus, did that happen or whatever? Right. And the fact that they didn't recant their story, they all stayed with it and said, no, seriously, this happened. Every time they were confronted, they said, let me tell you the gospel. They didn't back away. What did you learn in that as you were looking at the accounts of the eyewitness? Can they be trusted? Are they a witness that you would put on the stand and say, hey, let's listen to what they have to say?
Well, I can say, yes, they can be trusted, but how do we get there? How do we get from I'm not sure they can be trusted to they can be trusted? That's always the trick. And it's a lot of work to do that. And this is the same thing's true with the regular witness in a jury trial. You have to do a lot of work to make sure, okay, this I can put this witness on the stand. Why? Because I'm preparing a witness to stand up under cross-examination. So you're covering the areas of witness reliability, not because you're trying to be clever, because you're not a fool. The defense is going to beat this witness with a stick if you don't cover these areas up front. And the areas are where you're really there to see what you said you saw. This is all in the jury instructions. Can you be corroborated in some way, even though they don't expect to corroborate every detail? By the way, if that's your bar, well, then you don't have corroborative evidence. Is what I call touch point evidence. It's going to cover a percentage. If I said there's a guy who jumped over the counter and threatened this teller, well, where did he jump? He jumped right there. Okay, I better find his palm print there then. I look at sure enough, I get his palm print from the counter. Now, that doesn't tell me anything about what he looked like. Doesn't tell me anything about what the witness is going to say he was wearing. Doesn't tell me anything about the threat. It just tells me that part of the account can be confirmed because there's a palm print right where that guy said he jumped over the counter. Now, that's the nature of corroborative evidence. It gives you only a piece of the larger claim. But there better be something. A third thing, so we've talked about, were you there to see what you said you saw? Or can be corroborated in some way. 3, have you changed your story? Have you been accurate all along? Or like, is this thing starting to get fuzzier or change or get weirder as you tell it over the years? And then finally, do you have bias, some motive that would cause you to lie? And that's where the point you just made comes up, is that if you and I said that we would be willing to die for what we believe as a Christ follower, that would have no evidential value, because a lot of people die for what they don't know is a lie. But the disciples were the one group that would know if it was a lie. Their death has high evidential value, even though ours has no evidential value. And that's because they would be the one set. And you might convince one of these knuckleheads to die for a lie. But the fact that the entire group, that there's nobody ever in the history of any written material, in which there is a lot of written material against Christians, never do you find anywhere an account in which somebody who was an eyewitness decided to recant. They said, you know what, I'm out. And these guys were pressed pretty hard. Now, you can believe those stories in the first century or not. That's okay. There's no counter stories. That's what I think I would see. I would see somebody if nothing else, let's lie about these guys and say that one of them, let's do something to try to dispel the story. You just don't see that. And that's one of the things I think you would see if any of them had recanted their story. Now, how precisely did they die? There's a great book by Sean McDowell called The Fate of the Apostles, where this is his PhD dissertation on the death of the disciples. And you can grade those. Some have better grades than others. Some you can be more certain about than others. I get that. But here's what you don't have: counter stories. It's not like you're trying to weigh whether or not this Christian version of the death of the disciple is true versus the non-Christian story. There is no alternative. The unanimous testimony of what we have from history is the same, and is that these folks were willing to die for what they said they saw.
And they did. Outside of, well, John got a retirement home on the island of Patmos, but they did. They and here we are today having this conversation because of that. You would think, no one died of old age. No one died because they moved, anything like a boulder fell on their head or anything of that nature. As you're looking for yourself and you're trying, I wish more men would do this, get into it and 1 Peter 3, always be prepared to give a defense for what you believe. Was there an aha moment that you said, okay, now if that's a game changer?
There's lots of good things. There's lots of little, no, there was no like big aha moment for me, but there's lots of little, when you do an investigation like this, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. So these are all small things, and you include every little detail in the overarching case, because these are cumulative cases in front of juries. And what you'll do is you don't even know what it is that's going to impress the juror. So typically, for example, I'll ask the jurors afterwards if we get a verdict, we get a win, and then we're in the jury deliberation room, and we're sitting in that jury room with probably about 70% of the jurors who are willing to stay behind and talk to us, to both sides. What did we do well? What did we do? Why did you agree? Why did you not agree? And I'll ask these jurors, what was the thing that compelled you to what was your aha moment? And it's hard because these are cumulative cases. Usually there aren't, but somebody will say, well, I'll ask, what's the one piece of evidence that most impressed you? And it's always some weird thing. Like, I'm so glad we presented 100 pieces, because it turns out it wasn't until 99 that this dude was actually convinced. So you don't know. What if I only included 98 of those things? Then maybe he never would have been convinced. So this is the way that circumstantial cumulative cases work. And this is true for me also. There were lots of little neat kind of moments along the way where I would go, oh, that's so interesting. I talk about, for example, the undesigned coincidence. I call it unintentional eyewitness testimony that you see in the Gospels. And I won't go into detail on that, but that to me that was probably the most fascinating thing, when you would see some detail left unexplained. So if all I had was the Gospel of Luke, you'd be scratching your head. But then when you get Matthew's Gospel, or you get John, you go, oh, now I see the connection. Why ask that question there? Because they happen to be over in this location. Well, I didn't know they were in that location until you get to the second Gospel. And these kind of unintended corroborative kind of moments where something that seems puzzling is made sensible because you have more than one account. And this, by the way, is the nature of every one of my cases. You got 5 or 6 witnesses, it's going to be exactly like this, where if all you had was one, you'd be scratching your head. But because you have 6, you can reconstruct the scene in a way that makes sense now, even of that puzzling thing that number 1 said. So that was one of the things that struck me as interesting. Also, I would say that the kind of fingerprints of Peter in Mark's gospel were interesting to me, because I had heard from early church authority, Papias says that Mark was scribing for Peter in Rome, and that Peter's account, although accurate, it's not orderly according to Papias. It's not in the right order, but it does contain the life of Jesus, or the ministry of Jesus, through the lens of Peter, as recorded by Mark. And I thought, okay, well, if that's the case, I should be able to test it to see if there's any good reason to believe that Peter has influenced this. And so I just used forensic statement analysis, and I just went through the entire gospel, and I came away from that thinking, okay, well, that claim at least seems reasonable given the fingerprints of Peter that I find in Mark's gospel. And there's the little things about that. Again, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's the fact that Mark never says anything unkind about Peter. He never does. Even when Peter is a fool in every other gospel, Mark covers it. Either Mark ignores that, Mark makes him sound smarter, or Mark says, he said this stupid thing, but everybody else agreed. Only Mark does that because he's trying to make Peter look like less of the fool. And I think that's, for example, the only place where Peter doesn't get out of the boat and sink in the water, he sinks in Matthew's gospel, but he don't even get out of the boat in Mark's gospel because, Mark's covering for Peter. And I think that makes sense if Peter was his mentor and he's scribing. Either Peter didn't mention it when he was telling the story, or Mark decided to leave it out to do him a favor. But either one, it makes sense if Peter is the major source of information for Mark. So I think there's just a ton of these little things. And I know these all sound like paper cuts because they are. But that's what happens. If you get enough paper cuts, you're going to bleed out. And so that's what happens in our cases is we are trying to collect paper cuts.
I know one gospel he didn't write, and that's John, because clearly John pokes at Peter a few times, especially towards the end. I love where Peter says, "Hey, what about this guy?" And Jesus said, "Will you just follow me? Okay, will you just focus for a second here?"
I love that too. I love the fact that he describes himself as the disciple that Jesus loved.
And
right, because
he outran him.
Yes, and I think if you were to look at the Gospels and there wasn't a Gospel of John and ask yourself, who do you think is the disciple that Jesus loved? You'd probably come up with Peter, right? But John makes sure that he says in his Gospel, and that just sounds like John on the road with his brother asking Jesus, "Hey, can we be like the top two when it all said and done? Can we be the top two?" And even in the end, he kind of makes sure that he's telling his readers, we were the top two. So I think that was just, I love the human nature of the Gospels. And I think that there's humor and sarcasm and sarcastic humor in the Gospels. You just have to look for it and have to kind of put it in the context of the first century. There's such real, brutal honesty in the Gospels that you I think is helpful to not that it by itself. And I've heard people say that there's this principle of embarrassment that people will talk about. I personally don't trust it because I've seen really good liars. I mean, if you're a cold case killer, that means you probably did one murder once in your life, and then you were able to cover it for 35 years. You're probably a really good liar. And really good liars will use the principle of embarrassment to try to convince you that they're telling the truth. So I never gave it high. Now you'll see this in the Gospels, but for me, just as an investigator, that was not something that I thought was powerful. Just because I can think of one guy right now, just an unbelievably gifted liar who would use this so much a principle of embarrassment that I don't believe anything that he was saying was embarrassing was even true. He's just saying these things because he's trying to convince me this other part of the lie is true. So I weighed all of those as I was investigating the Gospels. Now look, here's all I'll say to you. I've worked cold cases for years, and I think I feel pretty comfortable working those cases. And as I read through these Gospels, applying the same test, I'm pretty comfortable. These are telling me the truth about Jesus. But if you're listening to this, I don't expect you to be as comfortable, and I don't expect you to trust me. I think that it's interesting to me that God has given more than enough evidence to believe this is true, yet enough wiggle room for you to reject it. And that's because God is a gentleman and he is love. And you cannot have love without free agency. He will not overwhelm you with the evidence. He's not going to do that because that means you would not really genuinely love him because it wouldn't be a free choice. By the way, he could have just designed you to believe in him from the beginning. He could have made it so that every human who opens their mouth and talks about God believes in Yahweh. He didn't do that because that wouldn't be love. Love it requires a dangerous prerequisite called free agency. If you are a God of love and you're going to create a world in which love can emerge, I have to create a world in which there is free agency, and that is dangerous. I have to create a world in which you have the freedom to hate me, because then when you decide freely to love me, it means something. That's exactly the kind of world that God has created. So I get it. I can make a case. I think it's compelling. I think the evidence is overwhelming, but I get it if people want to reject it. But at least take a second to look at the evidence first so that you'll know you're making a choice which is informed. I mean, most of us who are atheists want to consider ourselves as informed atheists. Well, okay, there's the challenge. Be informed.
Amen. Amen. And it's we talk about within our own home. You present the gospel. It's kind of a I can't convince you. I can't convert you. I have to present it. I have to live it out. I have to be equipped. I can tell you my story, but my story is not your story. I can tell you what Jesus done in my life, but at the end of the day, that person has to decide if is this true, and is it enough true in their life to die to themselves, be buried with Christ, raised to walk a new life. And if it's not, they take it or leave it. And you can't make them. I'd love to make them.
That's right. And let me just say something about that, because you're absolutely spot on. That's why I love when you start off by saying it's testimony and apologetics. And an apologetic, a defense, or a reason for why you believe that testimony, that experience you had actually came from God, came from the God of the Bible. Like, that's super important. And I don't see a lot of us doing that. But I would say that it is the gospel that has all the power. And the question then becomes, are you speaking the language of your hearer? So let's say you had a testimony, and your testimony is, this is my life. This is what happened in my life. So for me, this demonstrated that Jesus is who he said he was. Okay, well, if you said that in French, would it have the same power? If you're talking to an English speaker? No, it wouldn't. It turns out that the gospel has to be voiced in the language of the hearer, or it doesn't have the power, right? Otherwise, I could speak it in the ancient, in Aramaic, the way it was first voiced, never change the language for anybody, and it would still have the same power. Of course, it doesn't work that way. You at least have to speak the language of the hearer. But here's the problem, that hearers, language is more than just the words you speak. It's the presuppositions you hold. So if I'm going to argue that this is simply my truth in a culture in which everyone's comfortable with their truth and your truth, if that works for you, good. I'm going to respect you and love you that way, but it's not for me. I have my own truth. Those are the presuppositions of the culture we're living in right now. So we have to be able to make a case that, no, it's not my truth. That's why I'm so hesitant to share with you my testimony. Well, my testimony just happens to be that I didn't have a religious experience at all, but I did investigate the Gospels, and I can help you to see how what convinced me. But at the same time, I know that it's not my subjective view of this that matters. I always say all the time, I'm not a Christian because it works for me, or because I like it, or because it fixed something broken. I'm a Christian because it's true. It's true whether I like it or not. It's true outside of my desire. It's objectively true. I'm stuck with it. But now I can measure everything I had experienced subjectively based on this objective reality. And that's the difference. And so that's why I typically don't share my testimony, although my testimony involves investigating the evidence. But people will still say, after I say that, they'll say, well, yeah, but tell me your testimony. Like, give me the miraculous story about how transformed you were. Okay, look, I'm sorry if I don't have that kind of transformational story. I didn't get sober because I became a Christian. Have things changed for me? Of course. Am I a different person on this side than I was? Yeah, I could. But you know what? To be honest, that could have happened if I became a Mormon, or became a Hindu, or became a Buddhist. That doesn't really demonstrate anything. But what I can do is this. I can show you that this is the way that God interacts with the world. This is the way that God entered the world and presented himself to us. And I know this is true based on the evidence. And that does change things. If Jesus rose from the grave, like you said, he's the only one who's been on both sides of the divide. And that means he knows something that others don't. That puts him in a different category of sage, of ancient sage. So I think that's what changed it for me. Now, I did have an aha moment when it came to what the Bible says about me. I always tell people that you can look at the evidence for what the Bible says about Jesus, and you can get belief that, but you don't have a belief in until you start reading the Bible for what it says about you. And when I read what it said about me, I recognized right away it was true. But I never would have heard that. That would be a foreign language to me. My language was the evidence. So I would say to anybody who's communicating the gospel, like to your kids, who have been convinced that if it's true, the most it could be is just true for you. And my truth is okay too, different than your truth. Okay, we have to start with truth with our kids. Also, if you want me to believe that there's like a cure that's objectively true for whatever disease there is, well, do we really believe that? I mean, after COVID, we're all skeptical about every cure, right? And we think that everyone still says, well, the science says, the science says. In other words, they make a claim and they can back it up with evidence. You people with your religious claims can't do such a thing. Well, actually, it's not true. I think that's the language of culture we need to begin to speak, because that's where we are in this year, 10 years into this book. And I say one last thing about it, Jared. Here it is. It's no longer, is it true for Gen Z? And if they call the next one Gen Alpha or whatever they're going to call them, there's not, is it true? That was true for me as a boomer, but it isn't true for Gen Z. Gen Z wants to know, is it good? It might be true, but if it's evil, I'm out. And it seems like Christianity is teaching just the opposite of what culture is teaching on every major moral issue. And you people don't even have, you're all homophobic racists, misogynistic, bigoted. I mean, so the question we have to help our kids see is not just, is it true? Is it good? So my work is shifting 10 years in. 10 years ago, I spent a lot of time talking about, is it true? The last book I wrote, Person of Interest, is about, is it good? The next book I've got coming out next year is called The Truth and True Crime. Is it good? Because I think that this generation is less concerned with whether it's true, because true just means true to you. The question they have is it good? Well, I don't see how, as a boomer, something can be good if it's not true. So to me, that's the foundational issue. First, is it true? But even if it's true, is it good? So I want to be able to make both cases. And so for those of us listening, those of you listening to this, yes, your testimony, why is it true? Why is it good? Actually, there's 3 legs to that stool now, especially for Gen Z.
Well, brother, man, I really appreciate this. I've said it earlier, I'll say it again. This is a book that guys need to read, need to grab it. It's a great book to post-it note. I can't say the word, but post-it notes all over the place, just so you quick reference, whatever. Where should we go? What links do you want to share with us?
Just go to coldcasechristianity.com. That's a good place to kind of catch everything. You know, we have a website for police officers because that's where my passion is helping the next generation of cops. So if you've got listeners who are cops, that you can just go to thethinbluelife.com, thethinbluelife.com. And between those 2 websites, everything we talk about when it comes to how to, you know, let's face it, law enforcement is still a very muscular profession, even though that has more than just men in it, of course. Mm-hmm. A lot of women are serving as police officers, but it's still a muscular kind of masculine role you play, because you have to take the lead in so many situations where your presence alone is going to control. I think this is the generation of cops that needs to know that there is a God of the universe that can help them through their struggle. They can provide an identity which is unflinching, that can provide them help in times of trauma. So both those websites I hope are helpful.
Well, I found it on Amazon right here. It's only $17.99. Is that, seems like it could go for more than that. You're trying to retire? What are we doing?
What it costs a book? You know what? First, let me say this: the thing I hate the most, if I'm honest with you, is selling books. I want to write the books and make the case. I don't want to sell books. But this is the problem is that nobody writes a book they don't want anyone to read. So you end up talking about your books. But here's what I would say: exhaust what is available for free first. And on our website, we've got thousands of resources that are free. We post 3 times a week. It costs $0 to read and watch that stuff. Now, number 2, because I feel so bad even asking $17 for a book, because I think you should get everything from Christ for free.
You should be charging a lot more for this book. I'm telling you.
Well, so here's what we're trying to do. If anyone who purchases the book, you'll see the link there on our website. That the link is just coldcasechristianitybook.com. We are offering a 10.5-hour 30 video session casemakers course with all the written material and a certificate that you can earn that is available for free as a download if you buy the book. Plus more than 50 of these Bible inserts, which take the illustrations from the book and make them real for you, and a 410 slide PowerPoint. So you can make the case to others. Now, we're trying to give that stuff away because we feel like this is like an evangelistic calling, and we have a tendency, because of how our system works, to turn it into money. And so the question then becomes, well, then what can we want to over deliver. We want to under promise and over deliver. So I hope that we have done that with that offer.
And I'll tell you what, you need to get, well, not you, but I'm talking to the listeners, you need to get Cold Case Christianity for Kids. My kids are starting to get my daughters into the workforce and confronted about their faith, and, and they're trying to weigh, is this just a question or is this being antagonistic? So, but what I want to do with the herd is I want to talk, you didn't come to faith when you were 8. You came to faith later on in life once you're married and having kids. Now, I know there's a lot of guys, and they struggle with this, and they come to faith and their family's like, wait, what is this new thing you're doing and stuff? But we'll talk about that on the herd. Once again, men, I want to thank you for listening to today's podcast conversation with J. Warner Wallace. This book, and I made a comment on the podcast about the price of it on Amazon, how I think it's a steal personally. If you own the book, then you know what I'm talking about. But this book, I see in the email here, it's listed at $20. On Amazon, the day I was talking to him, it was like $17. I don't know what it is right now, but I'm telling you, if you purchase this book, one, you have an excellent resource in your library. Excellent resource to have on your shelf for a lot of things that could come up, especially when it comes to defending your faith and understanding what you believe and why you believe it. Secondly, I've bought a lot of books in my day, and I'm telling you right now, this book at this price is a bargain. I mean, you can probably find it cheaper somewhere else. Maybe you can find a used copy. I don't know. I don't get anything from selling his books. You guys know this about me. There's books I talk about, and there's books I promote. I'll talk about a book. If someone wrote it and they want to talk about it, sure. Then there's books that I promote and say, if you're going to spend some money, if you're going to add something to your Christmas wish list, this might be a book you want to add to your list. All right? Man, thanks for listening. I appreciate you subscribing, appreciate you sharing the show, your feedback, all those things, more than you guys realize. Let's keep pursuing biblical manliness.